Good evening, Super Horror fam, and everyone creeping it real with us tonight. Papa Bones here, ready to rattle your skeleton with tonight's tantalizing tale. Now we all love a classic, don't we? But what if I told you we're adding a twist tonight? Oh, not just any twist, my dear ghouls. This one's got all the hair-raising, spine-chilling elements you love, with a dash of blonde. That's right. Tonight, our leading lady isn't just any damsel in distress. She's a blonde bombshell of horror. So grab your popcorn and maybe a teddy bear as we dive into the dark and eerie world of Goldilocks and the Three Werebears.
Goldie drove down the winding road, her heart fluttering in anticipation. Goldie's what her friends called her. Her real name was Chloe, but she'd been called Goldie since she was a child because of her blonde hair. She was traveling from Pennsylvania to New York, to what was supposed to be one of the biggest haunted houses in the country. The website promised acres of scares, some food vendors, and a stage that would sometimes have live entertainment. The moon turned the asphalt into a silver path, and elongated tree shadows seemed to dance along her car as she drove. She hummed a tune playing on the radio, her fingers tapping on the steering wheel. But as she ventured deeper into the dense woods, the song on the radio became garbled. She assumed it was just poor reception, but it was far worse. Immediately after the radio dying, the engine shut off, and the car coasted to a stop. Goldie picked up her phone and tried calling AAA, but she didn't have a signal. She turned off her car's lights, thinking adding a drained battery to her car's troubles would only make things worse. She got out and began circling around her car with her phone in the air, hoping for a little cell phone service. But her position didn't matter. It was a dead zone. The absence of the engine's hum made the forest stillness even more pronounced. Taking a deep breath, she scanned her surroundings. In the woods, a faint glimmer in the distance caught her eye. A house. She began walking into the woods towards it. They should have a phone, she thought to herself. Her first steps were strong. They were placed with an air of enthusiasm and confidence. But after a while, her steps felt heavy. A combination of her creeping anxiety and her realizing the house was much farther than she originally thought. From her car, it looked like there was a cozy home just a little beyond the tree line in the woods. But the more she walked, the more she realized it wasn't a simple home. It was huge. It was just far away. Luckily the lights were on, or she never would have seen it from the road. With each step, the house seemed to get bigger. Pausing for a moment, Goldie glanced back, searching for the familiar glow of her car's reflectors. But she couldn't see them. She could get back to her car if she wanted to, but seeing the car through the brush wasn't possible, like the trees were somehow enveloping her past tracks. She felt a pit forming in her stomach as she realized if she couldn't see her car, someone on the road would not be able to see her. Then, out of the corner of her eye, in the towering trees between her and the car, Goldie noticed some shadowy figures stirring. They moved with a predatory grace, their forms shifting with the shadows, and their eyes reflecting the moonlight. Their eyes were hauntingly beautiful, until they fixated on a deer. In the blink of an eye, these two monsters jumped down from the trees and completely overwhelmed the deer. All at once, they ravenously ripped away at its flesh, as if the monsters had never eaten before. A cold rush of adrenaline surged through Goldie as she slowly backed up. The monsters were eating the deer so quickly, they'd be done in a minute, 2 minutes tops. It wasn't safe out there, and she would need to run past them to get to her car. There was no way she was going to take that risk. All at once, she broke out into a sprint, running as fast as she could towards the house in the woods. Goldie reached the house quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. At first glance, it looked like any other cottage tucked away in the woods. But as she got closer, its exaggerated features became undeniable. Every house detail was amplified. The windows were huge, stretching wider and taller than any she'd seen before. But what really caught her attention was the door. It loomed before her, a good 9 feet tall, and proportionally wide, making her feel like a small child about to enter a giant's home. A giant or not, Goldie didn't care. That deer wouldn't keep those shadowy figures busy for much longer. She quickly pulled open the gigantic door, stepped inside, and with a bit of effort managed to shut the massive door behind her. Taking no chances, she locked it, the heavy bolt thudding into place, granting her a momentary feeling of safety. Goldie tried to catch her breath. The large main hall was adorned with old portraits and grand chandeliers, their candles barely flickering. Thank God for them. If not for the candles, she wouldn't have seen the house from the road. As her gaze wandered, she was surprised by the sight of a child, locked in a cage. The child looked up, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Goldie's heart raced. Questions swirled in her mind. Who could have done this? What kind of person put the child in a cage? Was this some twisted trap for anyone unfortunate enough to venture into these woods? The size of the door, the cage, everything hinted at the possibility of someone far more formidable residing in this house. Her thoughts raced. If they would cage a child, what would they do to her? Pushing her fear down, she approached the cage cautiously, gently pressing her finger against her lips in a shh gesture. The child and her locked eyes, sharing a silent understanding. Goldie got close and whispered, "Are you okay?" The child nodded silently, "Yes." "I'm hungry." "Okay. I need to call the police, but my phone doesn't work here. Do you know if there's a phone in this house?" "Yeah, there's a phone in the kitchen," the young boy replied. "I can take you there if you need me to." And the child pointed to a key on a hook on the wall behind Goldie. Goldie thought about it a moment. She was so scared of making noise. Even the thought of walking to the wall behind her to get the key sounded risky. But opening random doors praying to find the kitchen sounded scary too. And as terrible as it sounded, if the child led the way and walked into a room with the house's owners, the child might keep the owner busy long enough for her to get away. As she unlocked the cage, she gave the child a warning. "Remember, we have to be quiet and go straight to the kitchen so I can use the phone." The child gave a nod, grateful to be let out, and together they began their cautious trek deeper into the mysterious house. Goldie followed closely behind the child, their tiny footsteps surprisingly assertive against the wooden floorboards as they made their way through the dim corridors. Goldie's eyes were drawn to the walls. Large, erratic scratches and gashes marred the otherwise pristine woodwork. It looked as if a wild animal had tried to claw its way through. What was this place? The child led her to a set of double doors, pushing them open to reveal the kitchen. Immediately, Goldie's senses were assaulted by a horrible odor. It was a mixture of stale air and something rotten. At the center of the room was a large wooden table, lit by a few randomly placed candles. Various dishes and plates were spread out, but the source of the smell was evident, a pot of meat stew that sat in the middle of the entire thing. Without hesitation, the child made a beeline for the table, quickly scooping up a spoonful of the stew and gulping it down. Goldie watched in horror and slight disgust. The meat, illuminated by the flickering candles, looked undercooked, and its origin was questionable. "Wait," Goldie whispered sharply, pointing to the old rotary phone on the wall. "Just let me make the call first, and then we can get you some good food." The child paused, locking eyes with Goldie. "But I'm so hungry," they whimpered, their small voice filled with desperation. Goldie approached the phone and picked it up, trying to be as quiet as possible. She felt her heart sink. The line was dead. Tracing the cord to the wall, she found it had been chewed through. Panic settled in, knowing their one hope of contacting the outside world was now gone. Distracted by her discovery, she missed the child's attempt to reach another plate of food. A loud screech filled the room as the child's fingers met the scalding hot contents of a dish at the head of the table. The plate was hastily pushed away, its contents spilling on the floor and the plate shattering. The sudden noise echoed through the house, and almost instantly a series of heavy thuds echoed from above. The child's face went pale. "Oh no," he murmured, his voice trembling. "We woke up Grandpa! He's more dangerous at night! We need to hide downstairs!" Goldie barely had time to react as the child's hand wrapped around her own, pulling her away from the kitchen into a door in the hall that she'd noticed before but assumed was a closet. As soon as they were behind the door, she realized it was not a closet. It was the entrance to the cellar. In the darkness, she could feel the child pulling her down. Goldie instinctively pulled out her cell phone, turning on its flashlight. The dim light revealed a narrow wooden staircase that the child was trying to get her down with all of his might. He clearly was familiar with the cellar. All at once he let go and went down the stairs in the dark. Echoes and reverberations from Grandpa's movement could still be felt throughout the house. Goldie began her cautious descent. Upon reaching the bottom, the flashlight revealed what you'd expect in a cellar. There were some dusty boxes, old trunks, cobwebs stretching between forgotten storage items. But just a little beyond the steps, things were far from ordinary. The room expanded into a larger space, the walls made of cold, wet stone, reminiscent of ancient dungeons from old stories. The defining feature of this room was what looked like an old prison cell, its thick bars going from wall to wall, intense dark metal that seemed to absorb the light. The child ran around the room, lighting candles, allowing Goldie to eventually see it all at once. Behind the bars, to Goldie's horror, were the remnants of what looked like a child's life. There were toys scattered across the floor, a small, well-worn bed, and a pile of old, dirty blankets in the corner. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the story of this hidden prison. Why was it here? Was it for this child? However, before she could think any further, the child ran straight towards the cage. It was like he was compelled, driven by some unknown force to get inside. He began trying to pull the heavy metal barred door closed. Goldie stepped forward. "Wait, what are you doing?" she whispered in her trembling voice. The child looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "It's safest here," he replied, his voice quivering. "When the bells ring, it's the most dangerous time. We have to stay here till morning." Goldie grabbed him and tried to pull him out of the cage, but suddenly the boy's demeanor changed. Panic took over, and he lashed out at her, biting her hand with a surprising strength. Goldie, shocked and in pain, released her grip, and the child retreated further into the depths of the cage, hiding beneath the small bed. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Every exhale sounded like a plea for help. Goldie nursed her bitten hand. Her heart raced, every beat echoing the mounting dread inside of her. A bone-chilling roar resonated through the house, a terrifying mix of raw power and anger. As the reverberation subsided, 2 more roars answered from the distance outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy lumbering footsteps rushing towards the house. Goldie, paralyzed with fear, looked up at the ceiling. She could hear the sound of the front door being pounded. With every blow, the cellar ceiling would shake like it was made of cardboard. This continued until Goldie heard a loud crack. It was the sharp noise of the front door shattering, sending splinters and echoes in all directions. Goldie's gaze darted around, searching for a way out, a safe spot. But the scratching and pounding at the cellar door confirmed her fears. They were cornered. In a desperate move, Goldie bolted to the prison cell and closed the heavy metal door. The child continued to hide under the small bed. There wasn't much space in the prison cell, but the thick bars were her only protection from the monstrosities. Goldie tried to focus on what the child had said. They'd be safe in the morning, but the ringing bells were dangerous. What ringing bells? Was there a church somewhere? Maybe an alarm of some sort. Then, her thoughts, the child's screams, and the banging against the door were all interrupted by the melodious chime of a grandfather clock. It was the bells the child had mentioned. Goldie was sure of it, because after the child had heard the bells, he began screaming even louder. As if on cue, another deafening roar tore through the room, followed by the sound of the cellar door being violently thrust open. Goldie's heart pounded even harder, her breaths coming in short gasps. With no other option, she grabbed the collection of dirty old blankets and draped them over herself, huddling in the corner, desperately praying she'd remain unseen. From her makeshift hiding spot, she peeked through a tiny gap in the blankets. 2 monstrous figures stormed down the steps. They looked like bears, but their jaws were wider, and their teeth looked more monstrous. Their hulking bodies cast immense shadows across the room. Goldie could feel herself completely vibrating in fear as she watched the 2 creatures clawing and slamming against the cage's bars, each blow causing the metal to resonate with a hollow clang. But the bars and stone held firm. Then the 2 creatures stopped completely. The boy continued screaming. But upstairs, movement could be heard again. Something was coming to the cellar. Goldie watched in terror as a 3rd figure emerged from the staircase. It was bigger, its fur grayer, its muscles more pronounced. Its eyes looked like they held an evil secret. The 2 moved aside, seeming to respect the larger monstrosity. The child's warning echoed in Goldie's mind. Grandpa. It was the elder of the beast, and clearly the alpha. Goldie held her breath, hoping the blankets would shield her from their eyes and noses. She clutched them tighter, feeling the cold stone of the wall against her back. The alpha took several swings at the cage with its massive claws, but the bars held strong. Having a little confidence in the bars, Goldie began to breathe a little. She shifted the blankets to see what was going on with the child under the bed, who was still screaming. But what she saw was not the innocent child she met earlier. In the dim light, she could see him convulsing violently. His small frame began to enlarge and distort. Bones cracked and reshaped, fur quickly covered his body, and his screams became guttural growls. Before her very eyes, the child was transforming into a creature eerily similar to those outside of the cell. A werebear. She watched horrified as the metamorphosis completed. The once familiar face of the boy was now completely gone, replaced by the face of a young, but equally ferocious monster. The final chime of the clock signified the end of the transformation. With his instincts driven by newfound hunger and the primal urges of his monstrous form, the child-turned werebear turned its attention to Goldie. In one swift motion, the creature lunged at Goldie. The blankets offered little resistance, and her terrified screams mixed with the triumphant roars of the werebears outside. The horror she felt was now overshadowed by the brutal reality of the cruel twist of fate that led her to this end.
Whew! Wasn't that a hair-raising ride, my fiendish friends? Ha! Now, before you scamper off into the night, I want to remind you, this year's Super Horror Calendar's theme is going to be dark fairy tales. On the screen now is Pinocchio and the nightmarish Pied Piper of Hamelin. There should be an official announcement next week, so keep your eyes and ears out for them. You're gonna need a calendar anyways, so you might as well get one that's awesome. Sadly, Goldilocks did not make this year's calendar. To be fair, this story was crazy enough. I'm pretty sure she bit off more than she could chew. Get it? More than she could chew?